Alright, hello everybody, welcome back. Today I'm smoking the El Septimo, the Culinary Art collection. And this one is the Nigori, the one that is meant to be paired with sake, apparently. I pair everything with coffee, so I haven't tried it with the sake, but if any of those people out there who are interested in their sakes, then this apparently is a good one to do. So today I kind of wanted to talk about Russia. Russia, China, the axis of resistance. I wanted to touch on a few things in this realm. I think because, well, it's so pertinent at the moment, isn't it? Um, this, what we're currently seeing is a huge anti-Western movement like we haven't seen before, um, at least not in the context of the last sort of 30 years when everyone thought that it was the end of history, and the liberals had won, basically, to put it in colloquial terms. So we'll get right into this. I'll just restart this up because I left it while setting up. So lovely. So I think I think one of the issues I wanted to touch on in regards to this topic is, will Russia have a cultural battle with China in the next 30 years? And the reason why I think this is an important question among the others that we ask about the Russia China and the axis of resistance relationship is because Russia currently sees its battle with the West as purely, not purely, but as mainly ideological, mainly a ideological cultural battle for the heart of Russia, which to some degree it does make some sense. The logic that has been extrapolated here because of the fact that the West and its partners wanted to spread global, um, not just global democracy, but the global liberal world order and capitalism across to every country in the world. Now, whether you argue for or against, if you look at the history of Russia and how it developed from the Soviet Union into the state that it is today, we can still see quite a lot of similarities in the autocratic management styles that have transversed. Now, I think that's partially, or hugely actually, a cause of the transfer of power in uh, the 1990s. Um, we saw a lot of communists, as one of my friends likes to put it, don pinstripe suits and call themselves capitalists, and I think that's a very apt description. So, seeing as we've got similar governance styles to the ex-Soviet, and let's be honest, a lot of the current citizens that live in Russia and Russian satellite states, they remember communism. They grew up in communism, um, and there's a almost an in inexorable link between the Slavic mentality and the Slavic culture, so to speak, and partially this idea of it being grown within communism and it having very communistic roots in that culture. Because Slavic culture is a bit of a difficult one to define, and I can't say that we really saw that in the annals of history when we're talking about Prussia, for example. I mean, the Slavic concept is a very new concept in terms of modern history. So, will if we're looking at China, if we're looking at Russia from a cultural perspective, the the issue becomes they want to separate themselves from the West, or to some degree. I mean, we'll get into it, but there is an argument that, you know, again, my good friend uh, has, discussed with me at length on this, um, and there is somewhat of an identity crisis in Russia, which I'm very keen to agree with him on that. But I think starting off at this point, we can see that there's a big link between the new Russia and the old USSR. And as we all know, old habits die hard. So, just donning a new suit and calling yourself a capitalist is all well and good, but the type of business that they conduct in Russia is very oligarchical. It's very monopolistic. Um, some would say that that's in line with capitalism more so than uh, the capitalists in America, or that's how the American capitalists wish to do business, and they're just a little more restricted. But whatever that argument may be, we do see there is at least some distinction between how Russia functions. Now, is part of this due to the fact that you have a autocratic state with a personalist leader, dictatorship? I would say it is partially so. I mean, a big chunk of um, the Western cultural export is democracy, which wouldn't fare well for Putin because he does have a lot of internal rivalry. I mean, not so long ago there was a shutdown of the internet in Moscow, um, in order to prevent communications between anti-Putin elements who were trying to start a coup. So I think we can point to this as being a big driver, but I think it's more nuanced than that, and it's a bit lazy just to put the whole concept on that, and just focus on that as being the main reason why Western influence isn't wanted in Russia, especially by the Russian elite, or at the very least by Putin and the Kremlin. Um, so yeah, so going back to the my point is the idea that Russia is willing to debase itself financially, and sort of almost willingly put itself under the thumb of the Golden Horde in order to progress its battle with the West is quite curious to me. I mean, this is not the idea that you have a neighboring great power and you're willing to in my opinion, it doesn't make huge amount of sense to put yourself under the thumb, in balance of power politics of a great power that you border. You share one of the biggest borders with, for a cultural war, in essence, for the soul of your country. Now, that being said, this existential crisis reasoning has a lot of strength and a lot of sway, not just in the Kremlin, but with the people as well. And I think the the main crux of this is that the threat from China is, I mean, in Putin's own words, is not ideological. It's not, uh, China's not coming for the soul of Russia. Um, there is speeches on this from Putin, um, but there is an issue with this because the the Chinese method of expansion historically has always been one of bringing in outside powers, outside by barbarians as they were called, um, and through links of trade and various other interactions to slowly Sinoify their allies and their adversaries that would be on their immediate borders at the very least. Let me just remove this so that it doesn't burn. Now, a lot of people argue, and myself included in this, that China is not so much the China of old. I mean, millennia of one a one track method almost for Chinese civilizational structure has been at the very least modified in order to fit the international world order, after the Chinese century of humiliation, and in order to combat the West as well, due to the West's role in the Opium Wars and other such uh, debacles in mainland China. Um, so I think the idea that Russia has that they're fighting a cultural war against the West and it's an existential crisis against the West. It's not just regime survival, but it's this deeper idea of protecting the almost the uniqueness of Russia and its Slavic style mentality, and culture. But I think with the way that China has, and I think Russia feels more comfortable given Chinese adaptation into the global framework, that they will not culturally assimilate Russia once the Golden Horde has it under its thumb. Ironically, as we've seen from multiple reports that come out of the axis of resistance, there is a lot of suspicion and there's a lot of discussion of China and its other, I guess, allies, or other Russian allies, really, as being enemies of the Russian state. So this, and when I was discussing this with my good friend, there was there was a lot of talk about paradoxes with Russia, which I personally do agree with. I think the idea that you have an ally that's an enemy in of itself is quite a paradox. Now, obviously, we all know that you know the allegiances of countries are very fickle. They're very fraught with um, potential you know breaks and even potential to develop into war, we see how the current NATO situation is struggling to keep allies together under the NATO banner. So it's not a rarity that I mean, take US and Europe for example. They've been spying on each other for years. I mean, more so, we hear reports of America spying on Europe. Um, the bugging and listening scandals. Um, these things are almost expected, I feel, even among alliances. That being said, I think the Russian problem with China is almost tenfold more so than the European problem with America. Um, these alliances in the axis of resistance, their main and only focus is to deter the West from being able to conduct its expeditionary forces and operations in far flung regions. So, do we see a China Russia relationship that could develop into a stronger alliance that surpasses this? Now, I think it all depends on how strong the West remains and how much the West pushes back against China's growth into a great power. But that being said, I think if the West crumbles or the West declines more so, and doesn't put pressure in these regions, I think we're going to see a big problem for Russia in China, within China, um, which is a strange calculation for Russia to make, considering they now rely on China for a huge amount of trade. All of their dual use components, a lot of the military, a lot of these military assets, um, and a lot of these military components, which can be used for, as I was saying, dual use, and the Ural oil barrels that flow into China. Russia is 100% more dependent on China than China is on Russia. So, will we see a cultural expansion of China into the Russian peninsula? And I think this is going to be a question that is going to see more weight going forward, as Russia depletes itself more and China grows in its great power status. Yeah, I thought so. I realized I'd been rambling. There we go. So, going back to what I was discussing concerning China's strategy for assimilation, so to speak. Now, I do think this is, I think, ironically, another thing that my good friend pointed out. Um, Ironically, Russia has a similar sort of strategy. This idea of, I think we saw it with Ukraine, um, before the war. Um, even in the run up to the special operation in 2014, we saw a strong rhetoric from Russia that the old Soviet satellite states should be closer to Russia, should make the effort to strengthen ties with Russia. And this is very reminiscent of Chinese mythology when dealing with peripheries, um, and border states. This idea of uh, an assimilation through culture, language, and trade. Um, and one of the main arguments that Putin made was that half of Ukraine speaks Russian, um, and the idea that Russian speakers should be part of Russia was one of his founding pushes for the special operation in 2014. I mean, obviously there's tactical implications. There's there's other strategic and balance of power reasons for that. Um, but the idea that these Russian people that are not in Russia should be part of Russia is ironically a very Chinese concept. Um, and I think China, while it's modified its behavior to some degree, it it still functions on a respect for the ancestral history and ancestral methods and thinkings of old philosophers. I wanted to talk about at some point if you know we if we can argue that the CCP is still using Sun Tzu's method um, of strategy when it comes to adversaries in the I forget what exactly it was, but there was a part. I'll have to look for it and do. Well, I was planning to do another video on that anyway. But whether this strategy that Sun Tzu um, stated for winning battles, being that the fighting is the last resort, and we see how patient China is, how it doesn't escalate unless desperately necessary, and this old mentality still permeates this idea of patience and um, this idea of I think interestingly it kind of reminds me of this. But one of my IR tutors was talking about how at the Greek Naval College, um, for war, I think it was it in Athens or Pyrrhus? I forget, but he said at the Naval College, um, it must be Pyrrhus because that's the port city. Um, he said that they had a Chinese delegation come in. Uh, Sorry, not a Chinese delegation. They had two Chinese officers come in, and I joked that it was like a Chinese diplomatic delegation because he said that when the Chinese officers came, they were very eloquently spoken. Um, they they were discussing like the Western Eastern divides and the strategies that both sides have in dealing with these divides. And he said it was very impressive the way the Chinese carried themselves, um, and these were officers. These weren't you didn't have a general or a diplomat. And I joked that they sent two diplomats in Chinese officer uniform, um, in order to do some some groundwork for building that relationship. But I think that there is a mentality, um, and I want to say it's adjacent to leading by example, which China tries to strive towards. This idea of being a great power isn't necessarily an idea solely on brute force or who has the best missiles, for example, but more so to do with this idea of you know and I think we see it in American media now. A lot of this, yeah, well, when TikTok was banned and all these Americans were on Red Note, and I see it a lot online. This idea of like Americans feeling like they're in a very Chinese time of their life. I feel like all of that stems from the idea that when people from outside look into China, there's an image of structure, prosperity, um, you know, I want to say like you know eloquent guidance, right? Um, and I think that's like these two officers in the Naval College, the idea of highly educated, highly intellectual, very diplomatic, well-spoken, prosperous Chinese people is the old strategy reinvented in order to be able to re I guess reintegrate and draw back in people on the border and from afar into the Chinese ideologies and into the Chinese way of life. Now, obviously you can't sidestep the authoritarianism. You can't sidestep these things. I mean, I did see a funny. Uh, there was a streamer who went to China, and he got into a bit of trouble with the Chinese authorities, and the same level of trouble that he would have got into in America, he would have, called the American police fascists, but over there he didn't, and I think that's quite a funny concept because you can't ignore the authoritarianism. um, yes, there is democratic backsliding in US, in UK, or across the world, really. Um, but democratic backsliding is you know a lot different to no democracy at all. And while people do tote that this is a good way to accelerate your economy, accelerate like China has, the authoritarian question doesn't doesn't preclude this. It's not that just because there's correlation doesn't mean there's causation. China have done well in this sense because partially because of their authoritarianism, but there's a lot of difficulties um, and I guess not. I guess you could argue there's a lot of flaws in the Chinese model because of the authoritarianism. Um, so there is swings and roundabouts like with everything. I mean, there's always going to be different uh, you know different pros and cons. But I think while we're on the topic, I definitely think that you know having being able to freely express yourself and such is going to be 10 times more important. I mean, look. I always use this argument. I think everyone does in the West. Glasnost. The Soviet structure being too rigid was a huge reason why innovation died. You know, I mean, you couldn't have a different opinion to your local communist councillor. Otherwise, you went to the gulag. and that's for little opinions. That's not even God forbid the big opinions, they would have shot you on sight. So these the going back to my original point, um, this whole idea of um, Russia and China, and them both having similar strategies in terms of this old Chinese version of assimilation. Firstly, China does do it better because they don't have a paradox that the Russians do, as my good friend put it. There is no paradox in, you know, wanting to be a part of Europe by invading European states. Well, there's more. It's more nuanced than that, but this idea of they had. Before the invasion, they had huge like trade partnerships, a lot of dissemination of Russian to European and European to Russian um, study programs. There was a lot of flow. You saw a lot of Russians in Europe, and a fair few Europeans in Russia as well before the war. So this idea that you know Russia wants to be a part of Europe. Recently Putin's daughter was found DJing in Paris, living a secret life as a DJ in France. This idea that you know Russians to some degree do want to be European, they just can't bridge that cultural gap in terms of the Slavic sense and the Slavic side of um, the culture divide. Leaves them in a bit of a paradox. It leaves them in a bit of a position where they're sort of torn between two sides. Um, but my good friend also said that they consider themselves the third Rome. Now I haven't looked into that. Um, and personally, I always considered Russia the second Byzantium. But if Russia considers itself the third Rome, then that's a very Western. That's a very Western mentality. That the third Rome, the whole idea of Rome is that it's the Western side. To be the second Byzantium would make more sense in my mind, due to the fact that they are Eastern. They have the Orthodoxy. The Orthodox Church is one of the most prominent establishments in Russia. So this idea that oh, you know, the Russians can have help from China without being assimilated to the point where they're almost a vassal state, which is what I've been seeing. Some analysts argue is that they're basically now almost a vassal state to China, um, in terms of how reliant they are. I think this idea that you know if you rely so heavily on a self-declared enemy, um, you're inviting a very disastrous end. Now, for Russia, of course, the main and most pressing threat to them is Western encroachment. It is NATO's ability to be able to strike Moscow. It is a number of these things. The cultural cap, the cultural, the capitalist, and the um, democratic push is one that Russia either doesn't want or isn't ready for. And I would argue that it is ready for that, um, from a people's perspective. But this idea that Russia can, you know, sort of delay the inevitable, um, by fighting this war and hoping that the Chinese problem will resolve itself or remain a background issue is honestly, I think, going to be one of their most major strategic blunders. Now, desperation has kind of pushed them into this, which you can argue makes makes some sense if if you're desperate and you see an existential threat. You're going to take the lesser of two evils. Um, but I think there was a personally, I think there was a big miscalculation from Russia to invade Ukraine and start a war in Europe. Um, given given how reliant they are now on China. Um, Now, in the balance of power, I would say if they could have done it without China, then it almost makes sense. Not that I agree with it from a moral standpoint, but Russia has always wanted to be a bigger player in the in the European balance of power politics. And part of their strategy, or their grand strategy for the future ascension of Russia, is taking a part of Europe and becoming a bigger player in the European uh, power dynamics, um, which I think makes sense from certain standpoints, but it leaves out glaring issues if you try and do that strategy. We're seeing them now. Like these, Ukraine is holding the line with European and American help, um, which was not within Russia's calculations for Ukraine. So, right, let's get this back on track. There we go. Anyway, this is a very nice cigar. Um, this one, El Septimo. I was gonna, originally I was gonna get a La Galera because they're a fan favorite of mine. Um, but what ended up happening was I saw this one and I just had to try it. So the humidor in the local tobacconist shop has a very good, very big selection. What I wouldn't do for a whole cupboard of cigars like that, a whole walk-in humidor. But anyway, so I think coming quickly back to, let me just check that this is still recording. Yeah, perfect. Coming back to this idea of, will Russia have an existential or cultural threat from China in the next 30 years? Uh, I would argue yes. Um, and the reason why I would argue yes is because all all analysis points to China, before this 30 years is up, becoming a great power if it's not already a great power currently. And the Chinese have always been very keen to manage Russia. Russia has been historically, it is naturally one of their biggest threats if we're talking by you know border, by like length of border sharing. It's one of the biggest countries in the region. Um, realistically, China and Russia are the two biggest countries um, in that region. I mean, I don't know if they're bigger than America or not. I haven't looked at a comparison map, but America is half the world away. Well, half the world away. Um, I mean, the globe goes both ways, so it's not necessarily true. But the idea that China has always seen Russia as a threat um, is only going to strengthen, I think, and the same vice versa as China rises through the annals of power. And I think because of the history between Russia and China, um, the Manchurian question. Um, well, when I say that, I mean the fact that Russia managed to cede great big swathes of territory off China when China were having trouble with the Europeans and the Americans. Russia has always factored in largely into the dangerous barbarians, so to speak. That's their words, not mine. The dangerous barbarians. Um, uh, I guess I don't know what the word is, but they've always factored in as as a top contender for Chinese monitoring and intervention historically. So I think Russia, in China's eyes, will need to be controlled, given its large border with them, given its a nuclear power, etc. So forth. Now, an interesting development in terms of the Russia-China relation, I think, is Russia's new reliance on Kim Jong Un and the North Korea for military arms, and obviously they've signed that pact, which which requires Russia to intervene in North Korea if war breaks out, and vice versa for Russia, which obviously that's already in play. It's between 12 and 15,000 North Korean troops on the battlefield in Ukraine at the moment. So I think this is going to add complexity to it. Um, I read a few foreign affairs articles recently about this. Very good writing, very very interesting, um, and I definitely agree for the most part with that. There is definitely going to be a lot of, and I think a big argument from the analysts were that China is going to have potentially more complex issues with North Korea, given Russia's involvement. But I think the same could work the other way. I think China can definitely have more complex issues with Russia, given its current alignment to North Korea. Now, North Korea is still a small, semi-pariah state. I mean, they've done well recently, um, mostly in terms of the Russian alliance with them, but they are heavily reliant on Beijing. So, Beijing can still push agendas in North Korea to some degree. Again, it can still push agendas in Russia to a large, well, not as large of a degree as in North Korea, but given how dependent Russia is now. What I would be interested to see is the Beijing calculus on how they can leverage. both states at once, because given both their dependencies, there could be a potential, almost a preemptive strategic um, calculus, I guess, to play one off the other in some way via trade, via you know rare earth and dual use components, considering that both will be vying for Chinese trade on these products for the most part. Um, Russia's not going to be worried about Chinese oil the same way that North Korea is, but these dual use and rare earth components, I think, are going to be the vice in which they can squeeze the juices of Russia and North Korea simultaneously, as they squeezed America with them. Oops. But anyway, so I think I think just to wrap it up in a conclusion, so to speak, um, I think Putin's calculation of of having a more pressing war with Europe for the heart of the country, I think, is understandable, but it is slightly misguided. I think the biggest threat to Russia is going to be China in the coming years, in the future, near or far. I think that will be the issue. So to rely on China now, um, China is not a state that doesn't project its culture. It's not a state that doesn't expect cultural understanding and some some form of integration if you border and if you trade with it, at least historically. Now, the argument that they've modified their strategy now is fine, but there is still elements of the old strategy and the old methodologies and the old philosophies in Chinese statecraft today. So the idea that they've completely abandoned this, I think, is going to be a poor calculation on the parts of Russia and the West if that's the thinking. For now, Russia is okay. Russia is safe. China, I think, will bide its time like it always does. And I think the axis of resistance is more important at the moment. The idea of Eastern payment system, a way to bypass America in more ways than one. Economically, militarily, all through alliances as well. I think this is going to be the strategy of the coming years. So Russia, for now, I think it's hedged its bets in the right position given the circumstances. But I do believe this will come back to haunt them, um, and there will be a second cultural battle for the heart of Russia in the future. Now, whether this will be one that, because Russia itself, as my good friend says, has a cultural paradox and a cultural battle of its own. Um, it doesn't quite understand what it is fully culturally. Um, I sure as hell don't. Um, took me a long time to wrap my head around the idea of you know Slavic culture and what that actually means. I think Russia definitely has its work cut out in the next few years in order to not just stay relevant, but stay alive, stay afloat, so to speak. Um, that being said, Russia's been put through a lot worse trials in the past. They've you know, the Russian history, especially the history of the people of Russia, has been one of overcoming almost insurmountable odds regularly. Um, um, Russia, Prussia, take it back to the Ottoman threat. Uh, you take it back to you know the Mongols. You take it back. I mean, Russia is the people of Russia have my deepest respect for their constant ability to I mean, firstly live in such a cold climate, firstly to live in like the middle of Siberia. I mean, obviously Moscow is closer to a North European state than you know in terms of like geography, weather, etc., and then the Siberian side. But my goodness, I mean, they have, yeah, I mean, to be able to just put up with that is a feat in itself. The remoteness, the isolation, the vast plains, and on top of that, always under threat, constant, constant uh, fighting, defense. Um, you know, a lot of them existential threats to Russia as well. I think again, this is detracting from a conclusion, but uh, I do want to add this point. I think part of the reason why Russia is so sensitive to cultural threats is because of the history of Russia and how many existential threats Russia has faced in the past. Um, the the constant uh, battle, so to speak, that the Russians have have fought from all sides really. There is a level of reactionary survival instinct on a societal level. I think from Russia, and I do think that's partially why it works so well as a reasoning within the population's uh, frameworks, because I mean a lot of them remember communism, and that that whole battle almost for survival against the US. Um, cultural and ideological survival. Now, of course, they lost that battle and they adapted, but the even if you take away from the history and you just focus on lived memory, this is still in a lot of lived memories. So anyway, I think that's gonna do it for me. I think I've said almost all of the things I want to say, and any more I'll probably end up running out of space on the camera. So yeah. So I think just to wrap up, Russia have chosen the lesser of two evils, um, in allying with China in the way they have. Um, but I do think it was a strategic blunder to try and play more into Europe, especially at this point in modern history. they had chances where it would have been more successful, and they didn't take it for some reason. I mean, the 2014 era really, um, it really does highlight that. Um, in 2014, they would have had a much better chance at doing exactly what they are doing now with success, and they didn't take it, which will always remain a curiosity to me. Why that happened, why it didn't play out like that and it played out like this instead, at a greater threat to the Russian state. Um, I'm sure there's reasonings behind it that we don't know yet, but I think Russia is going to have a cultural battle with the Chinese in the coming years, similar to the one that they had in the West. I say similar. I think again, China is more of a lead by example and assimilate by um, by trade type of civilization, rather than this Western idea of we're exporting democracy, not just through trade but through violence, which is, I mean, it's an interesting strategy, but as we've seen, it's not. There's times and there's places where that works, um, but for the most part, it's not really. I mean, US's example currently in Iran, you can't export democracy or a regime change at the very least in that method. Um, the idea that the populace is going to rise up after a 50,000 person massacre, it's just not realistic. Um, you know, the regime is too entrenched, and the repression is too strong. Um, they tried once, they saw the effects. You have to be you have to have nothing to lose. No businesses, no jobs, no food, no nothing, in order for that sort of uprisal to happen again in the circumstances. And while Iran is struggling, it's not struggling that badly. The people aren't dying by the thousands in the street. It's not like the French Revolution where everyone is in famine, and they're building the third palace of the king, or the second palace of the king. So anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about today. I do believe Russia will have a big issue with China in the future. But I think for now, the axis of resistance will keep them together. The idea of circumventing American sanctions will keep the axis of resistance together, and I don't think that's going away anytime soon. So I think you know Russia's made a calculated bet here. They made a calculated risk assessment, um, to heavily rely on China. For now, it will work. They will need a strategy to diversify and to remove themselves from this weaponized interdependence, that could be used against them by China in the future when China want to extract concessions or keep Russia in line with their idea of the global world order they want to produce and they want to develop. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay smoking.